The rain on Doran's reach fell in thin gray sheets, soaking into the mud of the work camp long before dawn broke. Raker stood outside the fence, his tail flicking once against the wet ground, watching the human workers line up for morning count. He was a dragon warrior of the Drakith Empire, tall and scaled, with eyes the color of burnt copper. He had served 15 years in the military, and in that time, he had learned to feel nothing when he looked at humans. They were labor. They were numbers. That was the lesson beaten into every Drakith soldier since birth. But today was different. Today was a culling day. The order had come down from the regional command 3 days earlier. Food supplies for the colony garrison were running low, and the Drakith High Command had decided that unproductive humans were a waste of resources. Children too young to work in the mines or the farms were the first to go. It was simple math to the Empire. It was not simple to Raker, though he would never have admitted that out loud. He walked along the fence line, his boots sinking slightly into the mud, until he reached the holding pen where the children were kept. There were perhaps 30 of them, huddled together for warmth, dressed in thin gray uniforms that did nothing against the cold. Some were crying. Some were too weak to cry. An officer named Draxus stood near the gate, checking names off a list, his expression bored, as if he were counting crates instead of children. Raker's orders were clear. He was to oversee the process and make sure nothing went wrong. Nothing wrong meant no interference, no delays, no mercy. He almost walked past without looking too closely. That was the safest thing to do. But then he saw her. A small girl sat near the back of the pen, her knees pulled up to her chest. She did not cry like the others. She did not look away when Raker's eyes met hers. She simply stared at him, her face pale and thin, her eyes steady in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young and so close to death. Her name, according to the list Draxus carried, was Ren. Something about that stare cracked something old and buried inside Raker. He had seen thousands of humans in his years of service. He had watched them work, suffer, and sometimes die, and none of it had ever touched him. But this girl looked at him not with fear, not with hatred, but with a strange kind of quiet dignity, as if she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Draxus called her name and motioned for 2 guards to bring her forward. The process was simple and cold. The weak were separated, marched to a containment field at the edge of the camp, and disposed of quietly, without fuss, without record beyond a single line in a ledger. Raker felt his hand tighten around the hilt of his sidearm before he even understood why. His mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, to let the process continue as it always had. He was a soldier of the Empire. He had sworn loyalty to the Drakith way, a way built on strength, order, and the belief that mercy was a weakness that led to ruin. But his body moved before his mind could stop it. He stepped between Draxus and the girl, his massive frame blocking the guard's path. Draxus looked up, confusion flashing across his reptilian face. "Warrior Vey, this does not concern you. Step aside." "This girl comes with me," Raker said, his voice low and steady, though inside he felt as if the ground itself might open beneath him. Draxus narrowed his eyes. "By whose authority?" "Mine," Raker said. The officer's confusion turned to anger. He reached for his own weapon, shouting for the guards to seize the girl regardless of what Raker said. In that single moment, something inside Raker shifted permanently. He drew his blade and struck before Draxus could raise his weapon, ending the officer's life in one clean motion. The guards froze, uncertain, caught between loyalty to the chain of command and fear of a dragon warrior standing over a dead officer with blood on his blade. "Stand down," Raker said. "This is now under my authority." The guards obeyed, more out of confusion and fear than understanding. Raker turned and lifted Ren from the mud, wrapping her in his own cloak against the cold. She did not struggle. She simply looked up at him with the same steady eyes, as if she had somehow known, in that terrible moment, that he would not let her die. As he carried her away from the pen, past the stunned faces of guards and prisoners alike, Raker understood with a cold certainty what he had just done. He had killed a fellow officer of the Drakith Empire to save a human child. There was no order, no regulation, no precedent that could excuse such an act. In the eyes of the Empire, he was no longer a soldier. He was a traitor. The rain continued to fall as he walked toward his ship, the small girl held close against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Behind him, the camp stirred with confusion and whispered fear, word already beginning to spread among both humans and Dracoth alike. A dragon warrior had broken ranks. A dragon warrior had killed one of his own to save a human child. Raker did not know yet what this single choice would cost him. He did not know that it would spark a fire across the stars, a fire that would burn through the Dracoth Empire itself. All he knew, as he stepped into his ship and sealed the door behind him, was that he could not have done otherwise. Something in the girl's eyes had reminded him of a part of himself he thought had died long ago, back when he too had been small, frightened, and alone in a galaxy that valued only strength. He looked down at Ren, who had finally closed her eyes, exhausted but safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. Whatever came next, Raker knew there was no going back. Steam rose from a bowl of untouched food as Ren sat cross-legged on the floor of Raker's quarters, staring at the strange metal walls around her. 3 days had passed since the culling field, and she still had not said a single word to him. Raker did not push her to speak. He understood silence. He had lived inside his own silence for most of his life. His quarters aboard the garrison ship were small by Dracoth standards, built for function rather than comfort. A narrow bunk, a desk covered in data slates, and a single window looking out over the gray clouds of Doran's Reach. It was not a place meant for children, human or otherwise, yet here she was, alive because of a choice he still did not fully understand. Raker sat at his desk, running diagnostics on the ship's internal logs, trying to erase any trace of what had happened at the culling field. It was slow, careful work. Dracoth systems were built with redundancy in mind, designed to catch exactly this kind of tampering. Every deleted file left a shadow. Every shadow could be traced by someone determined enough to look. He thought of his own childhood as he worked, memories he rarely allowed himself to visit. He had been raised in a military creche on the Dracoth homeworld, one of hundreds of hatchlings bred for war. There had been no parents in the creche, only instructors who taught that weakness was a defect to be corrected through discipline and pain. He remembered the first time he had shown fear as a young hatchling and the punishment that followed. He remembered learning, quickly, that mercy shown to the weak was itself a weakness. And yet here he was, protecting the weakest creature he had ever encountered. Ren finally spoke on the 4th day, her voice small but clear. "Why did you save me?" Raker did not answer immediately. He turned from his desk to look at her, searching for words that made sense even to himself. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "You looked at me as if you were not afraid to die. I have never seen a human do that before." "I was afraid," Ren said. "I just didn't want them to see it." Raker considered this for a long moment. It was, he realized, exactly the same lesson he had been taught as a hatchling, except she had learned it on her own, in a mud pit surrounded by death, without instructors or creche discipline to force it into her. There was something in that resilience that unsettled him more than any battle he had fought. Over the following days, Ren began to explore the ship in small, careful steps, always watching Raker's reactions before going further. She asked him blunt questions about the Empire, about the war that had brought the Dracoth to her world, about why the humans were treated as they were. Raker answered as honestly as he could, though many of his answers left him uncomfortable, forcing him to hear his own culture's cruelty spoken back to him through the innocent bluntness of a child. Meanwhile, the investigation into Draxus's death moved forward under the direction of Commander Threx, the garrison's ranking officer and Raker's former mentor. Threx was an old warrior, scarred and cautious, who had trained Raker since his early years of service. He did not believe the official report claiming Draxus had died in an accident during the culling process. Too many details did not align. A missing child, a dead officer, guards who gave vague, frightened answers when questioned separately. Threx called Raker to his office on the 6th day, ostensibly to discuss unrelated garrison matters. The conversation was careful, circling, each warrior testing the other without stating anything directly. Threx mentioned the incident at the culling field only once, watching Raker's reaction closely. "A strange thing happened," Threx said. "An officer dead, a child missing. The guards say little, but what they do say is troubling." "Accidents happen in the culling process," Raker replied, keeping his voice level. "It is unfortunate, but not unheard of." Threx studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Unfortunate indeed." Raker left the meeting with his pulse still racing beneath his calm exterior. He understood now that Threx suspected something, even if he could not yet prove it. Time was running out. He needed to decide, once and for all, what he intended to do with the child hidden in his quarters. That night, he found Rin sitting by the window, watching the rain fall over the colony below. She turned to look at him as he entered, her eyes no longer filled with the same raw fear he had seen at the culling field, but something else now, something closer to trust. "Are you going to send me back?" she asked quietly. "No," he said finally. "I am not sending you back." Rin did not smile, but something in her posture eased, as if a weight she had been carrying since the culling field had finally lifted, if only slightly. Raker watched her settle back against the window, staring out at the rain, and understood that whatever came next, he had already made his choice. The only question left was how far he was willing to go to keep it. Word travels fast in a place where hope is rare, and by the second week, the story of the culling field had spread through every corner of the human settlement on Doran's Reach. It moved through whispered conversations in the mines, through notes passed hand to hand in the farming fields, through quiet words exchanged between exhausted workers during the few minutes of rest they were allowed each day. A dragon warrior had killed one of his own kind to save a human child. To the Dracath, this was an unthinkable crime. To the humans, it was something close to a miracle. In a hidden bunker beneath the ruins of what had once been a town hall before the invasion, a group of humans gathered in the dim light of a single working lamp. Their leader was a man named Colonel Hale, once an officer in the human colonial defense force before the Dracath fleet had crushed what little resistance the planet could muster. He was older now, his hair gray, his face lined with years of hiding and loss. He had watched his own family die in the initial invasion, and in the years since, he had built a small network of resistance fighters from the survivors, though their efforts had amounted to little more than sabotage and stolen supplies. "You are certain of this?" Hale asked the young woman who had brought him the report, a former mine worker named Sela who had contacts throughout the camp. "Everyone is talking about it," Sela said. "A warrior named Raker Vey. He killed an officer in front of witnesses and took a child. The garrison is searching for them both." Hale considered this carefully. In his years leading the resistance, he had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. A Dracath soldier turning against his own kind sounded exactly like the sort of story the Empire might invent to draw resistance fighters out into the open. "It could be a trap," he said. "The Empire has used false stories before to expose sympathizers." "It could be," Sela agreed. "But if it is true, it changes everything. If even one of them can turn against the Empire, others might follow." Hale did not answer immediately, weighing the risk against the possibility. For years, the resistance had operated on the assumption that the Dracath were united, unshakable in their belief in their own superiority. If that assumption was wrong, if even a single dragon warrior could feel enough to break ranks over the life of one child, then perhaps the foundation the Empire stood upon was not as solid as it appeared. Meanwhile, aboard the garrison ship, Raker found himself walking a line growing thinner by the day. Threx's suspicions had not faded, and the commander had begun quietly reassigning guards and reviewing logs with increasing scrutiny. Raker knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, yet he found himself unable to regret the choice he had made. Ren, for her part, had grown more comfortable in the weeks since her rescue, though she remained cautious, watchful in the way that only someone who had nearly died could be. She had taken to observing Raker closely, learning his habits, the way he moved, the small gestures that betrayed his moods even when his reptilian face gave little away. One evening, as he prepared a simple meal in his quarters, she asked him a question that had clearly been forming in her mind for some time. "Do the other Dracath feel things too? Or are you different?" Raker paused, considering how to answer. "We are taught not to feel," he said finally. "From the moment we hatch, weakness is punished. Compassion is seen as a flaw. We are meant to be strong, disciplined, loyal only to the Empire." "But you saved me," Ren said. "That doesn't sound very disciplined." Despite himself, Raker felt something close to amusement at her bluntness. "No," he admitted. "It does not." It was during this conversation that a soft knock came at his door, unexpected and unscheduled. Raker tensed immediately, motioning for Ren to hide behind a storage panel he had adapted for exactly this purpose. He opened the door cautiously, prepared for the worst, only to find a hooded figure standing in the corridor, a human, moving with the careful posture of someone accustomed to avoiding notice. HFY, the figure said quietly, pulling back the hood to reveal a weathered human face. It was Hale himself, having taken an enormous risk to reach the garrison ship through channels Raker did not yet understand. I need to know if the stories are true. Raker studied him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him enter, glancing quickly down the corridor to ensure they had not been seen. Inside, Ren emerged from her hiding place, and upon seeing her, Hale's expression shifted from cautious suspicion to something closer to disbelief. "She's alive," he murmured. "She is," Raker confirmed. "And I intend to keep her that way." Hale looked between the girl and the dragon warrior for a long moment, clearly recalculating everything he had assumed about the nature of their enemy. "If what you've done is real," he said slowly, "then you may be the first crack in a wall we thought could never break." Raker did not fully understand yet what Hale meant by those words, but he sensed the weight behind them, the beginning of something far larger than a single act of mercy in a muddy field. Whatever came next, he understood there would be no return to the life he had known before. The empire he had served for 15 years was about to learn that even a dragon warrior could be broken open by the smallest act of kindness, and that once broken, there was no simple way to put things back together again. The alarm that woke Raker was not the one he had been dreading, but it was close enough to send ice through his blood the moment he heard it. A summons, direct from Commander Threx, requiring his immediate presence in the command chamber. No explanation given. No delay permitted. He looked at Ren, still asleep in the corner of his quarters where she had made a small nest of blankets over the past weeks. He considered waking her, warning her, but there was no time and nowhere safe to send her regardless. He touched her shoulder gently, just enough to stir her without startling her fully awake. "Stay here. Do not open the door for anyone but me," he said quietly. She nodded, still groggy, and he left before she could ask questions he did not have time to answer. The command chamber was colder than usual when Raker arrived, or perhaps it was simply his own nerves making the air feel that way. Threx stood at the center of the room, flanked by 2 armed guards, his expression unreadable in the way only an old and experienced warrior could manage. On the table before him sat a data slate, its screen displaying security footage Raker recognized immediately, footage from the culling field, the moment his blade had ended Draxus's life. "I have known you since you were a hatchling barely out of the creche," Threx said, his voice heavy with something that might have been disappointment or might have been something closer to grief. "I trained you myself. I vouched for your promotion through 3 ranks. Tell me, Raker, why would you do this?" There was no point in denying what the footage clearly showed. Raker straightened his shoulders, meeting his old mentor's gaze directly. "The girl did nothing to deserve death," he said. "Draxus would have killed her without hesitation, along with dozens of others too young or too weak to work. I could not stand by and watch it happen." "You could not stand by," Threx repeated slowly. "And so you murdered a fellow officer. You committed treason against the empire that raised you, trained you, gave you purpose and strength, all for the sake of one human child." "Yes," Raker said simply. Threx's expression hardened. "Bring the child forward. Surrender her, and I will personally argue for leniency in your punishment. Refuse, and there will be no mercy shown to either of you." Raker felt the weight of the choice settle over him like a physical thing. He thought of Ren, asleep and trusting in his quarters, believing he would return for her. He thought of everything the Empire had taught him about strength, discipline, and loyalty, lessons burned into him since before he could properly walk. And he thought of the moment in the mud, when a small girl had looked at him without fear, and something inside him had shifted forever. "I will not surrender her," Raker said. The guards moved immediately, weapons raised, and Threx's face twisted with something between fury and sorrow. "Then you leave me no choice." What followed happened faster than conscious thought allowed. Raker moved first, drawing his blade and disarming the nearest guard in a single fluid motion honed by 15 years of combat training. The second guard fired, and Raker felt the burn of a plasma round grazing his shoulder as he closed the distance. ending the confrontation before further shots could be fired. Threx stood alone now, unarmed but unafraid, watching his former student with an expression Raker would remember for the rest of his life. "You have started something you cannot stop," Threx said quietly. "The Empire will not simply let this go." "Then the Empire will have to catch me first," Raker replied, before turning and sprinting from the chamber, alarms already beginning to blare throughout the ship as word of the confrontation spread. He reached his quarters to find Ren already awake, listening to the chaos unfolding beyond the door. There was no time for explanation. He gathered what supplies he could carry and led her through corridors he knew from years of service aboard the garrison ship, taking paths designed to avoid the main patrol routes. Outside, the human resistance had been watching for exactly this moment, warned somehow, perhaps by Hale's own network of contacts within the garrison staff. As Raker and Ren emerged near a maintenance airlock on the ship's lower level, a small group of resistance fighters was already there, armed with whatever weapons they had managed to smuggle or steal over the years, ready to cover their escape. The fighting that followed was brief but brutal. Drakith soldiers, confused and disorganized by the sudden uprising, struggled to respond effectively against fighters who knew every hidden passage and weak point in the ship's lower levels. Raker fought alongside humans for the first time in his life, his blade cutting down soldiers he had once called brothers, each strike severing another thread connecting him to the life he had known. They reached the surface as dawn broke over Doran's Reach, smoke rising from several points across the garrison compound where sabotage and open fighting had already begun to spread. Word of Raker's defiance had ignited something the Empire could not easily extinguish. Across the colony, humans who had lived for years under Drakith rule began to rise, emboldened by the knowledge that even a dragon warrior could turn against the Empire's cruelty. By nightfall, the Drakith High Command had issued a formal declaration, branding Raker Vey an enemy of the Empire and placing a substantial bounty on his capture, dead or alive. Ren, exhausted but safe beside him in the hidden resistance camp deep within the colony's ruined outskirts, looked up at him with the same steady eyes he remembered from the culling field. "What happens now?" she asked. Raker looked out over the growing fires in the distance, the sound of distant fighting still echoing across the colony. "Now," he said quietly, "we fight." Months had passed since the night Raker fled the garrison ship, and the hidden resistance camp deep in the ruins of Doran's Reach had grown into something resembling a small army. What had once been a handful of desperate fighters hiding in tunnels now numbered in the hundreds, drawn from mining settlements, farming villages, and scattered pockets of survivors across the colony who had heard the story of a dragon warrior who chose mercy over loyalty. Raker stood at the edge of a makeshift training yard carved out of an old storage warehouse, watching a group of human fighters practice formations he had taught them, adapted from Drakith military tactics, but modified for human strength and speed. He had spent the months since his escape training anyone willing to learn, sharing knowledge that had once belonged exclusively to the Empire he had abandoned. Ren stood beside him now, no longer the frightened, starving child from the culling field. She had grown taller in the months since, though still young, her eyes carrying a sharpness that came from surviving things no child should have to survive. She had become fluent in reading Drakith body language and tone, skills that made her invaluable during tense negotiations between Raker and the human resistance leaders who still, even now, harbored doubts about trusting a Drakith warrior completely. "They're improving," Ren said, watching the fighters below. "They are," Raker agreed. "But improvement will not be enough against what is coming." Word had reached the resistance 3 days earlier through smuggled communications intercepted from Drakith channels. Colonel Hale called a meeting that evening in the underground command center the resistance had built beneath the ruins of the old town hall. "Vorn Drakith does not negotiate," Hale said, addressing the gathered leaders. "His fleet will arrive within the week. If we meet them in open conflict, we will lose. We do not have the ships, the weapons, or the numbers to survive a direct confrontation." "Then we do not meet them in open conflict," Raker said, stepping forward. "We use what we have: speed, knowledge of the terrain, and surprise. The Empire's strength lies in overwhelming force. Their weakness lies in their arrogance. They will not expect a fractured colony to fight with coordination or strategy." Over the following days, Raker worked alongside Hale and the Resistance's small group of former colonial military officers to develop a plan built around guerrilla tactics rather than direct confrontation. They would use the colony's mountainous terrain and dense forests to their advantage, striking supply lines and smaller patrol vessels rather than engaging the main fleet directly. Most critically, they would attempt to capture one of the fleet's smaller warships during a routine patrol, using it to infiltrate the main fleet's defenses when the final assault came. The plan was dangerous, relying on precise timing and no small amount of luck, but it was the only realistic chance the Resistance had against a force so vastly superior in raw military power. The operation began under cover of darkness 8 days after the fleet's arrival in orbit around Doran's Reach. Raker led a small strike team, including several defected Dracoth soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the Empire's cruelty after hearing of his defiance, toward a routine patrol vessel making its rounds near the colony's northern mountain range. The ambush was swift and brutal, the patrol vessel's crew caught entirely by surprise as Raker's team boarded through a maintenance airlock he had knowledge of from his years of service. With the vessel captured, Raker and his team used its transponder codes to slip past the main fleet's outer defenses, positioning themselves near the flagship under the guise of a routine supply run. What followed was a desperate, chaotic assault, human resistance fighters and defected Dracoth soldiers working together to disable critical systems aboard the flagship while, on the surface below, the remaining resistance forces launched coordinated strikes against the fleet's ground support installations. The battle raged for hours, the sky above Doran's Reach lit with the flashes of ship-to-ship combat and the distant thunder of ground assaults. Losses were heavy on both sides, and at several points during the engagement, it seemed as though the Resistance's ambitious plan might collapse entirely under the weight of the Empire's superior firepower. But the element of surprise, combined with Raker's intimate knowledge of Dracoth tactics and technology, proved decisive. The flagship's critical systems failed at a crucial moment during the engagement, throwing the fleet's coordination into disarray long enough for the Resistance's ground forces to overwhelm the remaining support installations. By dawn, what remained of Vorn Dracoth's punitive fleet was in full retreat, badly damaged, and unable to continue the assault. The victory, though costly, sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Doran's Reach. News of the battle spread through smuggled communications to other conquered worlds across the Dracoth Empire, carrying with it the story of a dragon warrior who had chosen to stand with humanity rather than against it, and of a rebellion that had, against all odds, defeated an imperial fleet. Standing amid the wreckage of the battle's aftermath, Raker looked out over the scarred landscape of Doran's Reach, Ren beside him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. Around them, human fighters and the small group of defected Dracoth soldiers worked together to tend to the wounded and begin the long process of rebuilding what the battle had destroyed. "We won," Ren said softly, almost as if she did not quite believe it herself. "We survived," Raker corrected gently. "The Empire will not forgive this. They will send more, stronger, angrier than before." Raker said nothing, but as he looked out over the colony, now stirring with a fragile hope it had not known in years, he understood that whatever the Empire sent next, they would face not just a single rebellious warrior, but a growing alliance willing to fight for something greater than survival. Smoke still lingered over the mountains of Doran's Reach 3 weeks after the fleet's defeat, but the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength before it broke. Raker knew this silence well. He had lived through enough campaigns in Dracoth service to recognize the calm that came before an enemy's final, overwhelming response. The Empire's reply came not as another fleet, but as something far more personal. A single ship descended through the colony's atmosphere under a banner of formal parley, carrying with it a name that made even the most hardened resistance fighters uneasy when it reached the underground command center. Commander Threx had come to Doran's Reach, not as an invader, but as an emissary sent to end the rebellion through one final confrontation. Raker read the message himself, delivered through an intercepted Dracoth channel, demanding a personal duel between himself and his former mentor. If Raker won, the Empire would withdraw its forces from Doran's Reach and formally recognize the colony's independence, A concession Raker suspected the Empire never intended to honor fully, but offered nonetheless as a way to end the growing embarrassment his rebellion had caused. If Threx won, the resistance would surrender entirely, and Raker's death would serve as a warning to any other Dracoth who might consider following his example. Hale argued against accepting the terms, certain it was a trap designed to eliminate Raker and demoralize the resistance in a single stroke. Ren, now older and marked by months of war, said little during the debate, though Raker could see the fear behind her steady eyes, fear not for herself, but for him. In the end, Raker accepted the challenge, understanding that refusing would only prolong a conflict the colony could not sustain indefinitely. The Empire's patience was not infinite, and eventually, a fleet larger and more determined than the last would arrive regardless of what happened here. A decisive resolution, even a dangerous one, offered a chance at something the endless guerrilla war could not, a true ending. The duel took place on the open plain where the culling field had once stood, the same muddy ground where Raker had first defied his own kind to save a single human child. It felt fitting, somehow, that everything should come full circle in this place, marked by both cruelty and mercy in equal measure. Threx arrived alone, as the terms demanded, his scaled armor bearing the marks of decades of loyal service to an empire that had shaped both their lives from birth. He looked older than Raker remembered, though his stance remained as steady and dangerous as ever. "You did not have to come yourself," Raker said as they faced each other across the field, human fighters and Dracoth defectors alike watching from a respectful distance. "I trained you," Threx said simply. "It is only right that I be the one to end this, one way or another." The duel began without further words, both warriors moving with the speed and precision that marked them as elite among their kind. Blades clashed in the gray morning light, each strike a testament to years of shared training now turned against one another in a battle neither truly wanted but both understood was necessary. Threx fought with the discipline of a lifetime spent enforcing imperial order, every movement calculated and precise. Raker fought with something different, a desperation born not of fear for himself, but of everything he now had to protect. The battle stretched long, neither warrior gaining a clear advantage for many tense minutes, until finally, Raker saw an opening born not of superior skill, but of Threx's own hesitation. A fraction of a second where old affection for the student he had raised overcame the discipline of decades. Raker did not hesitate to take the opening, ending the duel with a decisive strike that left Threx wounded but alive, unable to continue the fight. Silence fell over the field as Raker stood over his former mentor, blade still raised, the weight of the moment settling over everyone watching. He could end it here, as the old ways demanded. Instead, he lowered his weapon. "Enough," Raker said quietly. "There has been enough killing between us." Threx looked up at him from the ground, something unreadable in his eyes, perhaps respect, perhaps regret, perhaps simply the exhaustion of a warrior who had spent his entire life serving an empire that valued strength above all else, only to be defeated by the very mercy that empire had taught him to despise. The empire, true to at least the letter of its word, withdrew its forces from Doran's reach in the weeks that followed, though whispered warnings suggested the peace would not last forever. Still, for the first time in years, the colony breathed freely, its people beginning the long, difficult work of rebuilding what the war had taken from them. Raker stood once more at the edge of the same field, now months later, watching the sun set over a colony slowly healing from years of occupation and war. Beside him stood Ren, no longer a child, but a young woman shaped by everything she had survived, her eyes still carrying that same steady strength he had first seen in the mud of the culling field. In the distance, a small ship descended toward the colony, carrying representatives from other worlds who had heard the story of Doran's reach and its dragon warrior, worlds seeking guidance, alliance, or simply proof that the Empire could indeed be challenged and beaten. "It's not over, is it?" Ren said, watching the ship approach. "No," Raker admitted. "This was only the beginning." He looked down at her, this human child who had once looked death in the eye without flinching, who had somehow, through nothing more than her own quiet courage, changed the course of his entire life and started a war against everything he had once believed in. Whatever came next, whatever battles still lay ahead across the vast reaches of a galaxy still ruled by an empire unwilling to accept defeat, Raker knew he would face them the same way he had faced that first, defining choice in the mud of the culling field. Not as a dragon warrior bound by imperial loyalty, but as something new, something built from mercy rather than strength. Standing beside those he had once been trained to see as nothing more than numbers to be counted and discarded. The sun set fully over Doran's reach, and in the quiet that followed, a new chapter of the galaxy's history began to take shape, born from a single act of kindness that no empire, however powerful, could ever fully undo.